Picture this. It is the tail end of 1988 in Japan, a time when the country is riding the absolute peak of the economic bubble. Tokyo is a neon-soaked dreamscape where cash flows like water, the music is loud, and the future looks blindingly bright. It's a society obsessed with image, with perfection, with the idea that if you work hard and follow the rules, nothing can touch you. But peel back that glittering layer of wealth and order, and you find something rotting underneath. Something so dark that looking at it directly feels like staring into the abyss. We are in Misato, in the Saitama prefecture, a place that feels safe, suburban, and totally ordinary. It is the kind of place where neighbors nod at each other, but don't ask questions. Where the walls are thin, but the social barriers are thick. And walking down one of these quiet streets is a girl named Junko Furuta. She is 17 years old, beautiful, popular, and by all accounts, the kind of person who has her entire life mapped out in front of her. She has dreams. She has a part-time job. She has a smile that lights up a room. But on a cold November evening, as she cycles home from her job at a plastic molding factory, the darkness that has been festering in the cracks of this perfect society is waiting for her. It isn't a monster from a movie. It is something far worse. It is a group of boys she might have passed in the street, boys who look just like anyone else's sons. And what happens next isn't just a crime. It is a descent into a hell so profound that it challenges the very definition of what it means to be human. You have to understand the atmosphere of that night to really grasp the horror of it. It was November 25th. The air was crisp, and the sun had already dipped below the horizon, leaving the streets bathed in that artificial twilight of street lamps and vending machines. Junko was doing everything right. She wasn't out partying. She wasn't looking for trouble. She was just a kid going home after a shift, probably thinking about school the next day, or maybe a TV show she wanted to watch. She had absolutely no idea that a boy named Hiroshi Miyano, a name that should make your skin crawl, had been watching her. Miyano wasn't just a bad kid. He was a predator in the making, a small-time Yakuza wannabe who desperately wanted to feel powerful. He had friends, if you can call them that, who were just as broken and depraved as he was. When he saw Junko, he didn't see a human being with rights and feelings. He saw an object he could possess. He kicked her off her bicycle. Just imagine that moment. The sudden jolt, the scrape of metal on pavement, the confusion. And then the manipulation began. It wasn't a violent snatch and grab initially. It was psychological warfare. They played the Good Samaritan, pretending to help her, offering to walk her home, weaving a web of lies so tight that by the time she realized she was trapped, the spider had already closed in. It terrifies me to think about how easily innocence can be weaponized against us. This is where the story shifts from a tragic accident to a systematic failure of humanity that makes me want to scream. They took her to a house in the Ayase district of Tokyo, a 2-story home that belonged to to the parents of one of the boys, a guy commonly referred to as Boy C or Minato due to legal protections, which is a whole other controversy we will get to later. Now keep this in mind. This wasn't an abandoned warehouse in the middle of nowhere. This was a family home. There were parents living there. There was a brother living there. And yet, for 44 agonizing days, Junko Furuta was held captive in a second-floor room, subjected to torture that I frankly struggle to find words for. It wasn't just abuse. It was the total dismantling of a soul. These boys, these monsters, masquerading as teenagers, treated her like a toy they could break and put back together just to break again. And the world outside kept spinning. People went to work, families ate dinner, television shows played, all while a 17-year-old girl was living a nightmare as mere feet away from civilization. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? How much evil is happening right next door to us while we sit comfortably on our sofas, completely oblivious. The ignorance of the people around that house is almost as criminal as the acts of the boys themselves. Let's dive a bit deeper into the background of these perpetrators, because I think it's crucial to understand that monsters aren't born. They are made, or at least allowed to fester. The leader, Miyano, was a high school dropout with connections to the local Yakuza. He was short, physically unimposing, and reportedly had a massive inferiority complex. He compensated for his small stature with extreme violence and a desperate need to control others. He was the kind of guy who needed everyone to fear him because he didn't have any real respect for himself. Then you had the others, Boy B, Boy C, Boy D. They were a pack. You know how wolves hunt? They isolate the weak. But these weren't wolves. They were cowards. They fed off each other's cruelty. It was a classic case of groupthink gone wrong. One would suggest something horrific, and instead of stopping him, the others would escalate it, like it was a game of who can be the most depraved. They were drunk on power, high on the fact that they held the life of this beautiful, innocent girl in their hands. They forced her to call her parents, to tell them she had run away, to tell them not to look for her. Can you imagine the psychological terror of that? Being forced to tell the people who love you most that you've abandoned them while you are actually begging for death to release you? It is a level of cruelty that requires a complete absence of empathy. We need to talk about Junko herself, because often in these stories, the victim becomes just a name, a statistic attached to a gruesome headline. But Junko was real. She loved music. She was reportedly a fan of the band The Checkers. She had a gentle demeanor. During those 44 days, despite the unimaginable pain, the starvation, the humiliation, she tried to maintain her dignity. There are reports that she tried to sew buttons back onto the boys' clothes or clean up the room, perhaps in a desperate attempt to humanize herself in their eyes, to trigger some tiny spark of mercy in their blackened hearts. It breaks my heart to think of her doing that, trying to be a good girl in the middle of hell, hoping that if she just followed the rules, the nightmare would end. She begged them to let her go. She begged them to just kill her when the pain became too much. But they didn't want to kill her. They wanted to own her. They fed her cockroaches. They burned her. They beat her until her body was unrecognizable. And through it all, she was just a child who should have been worrying about final exams or a crush on a boy, not wondering if she would survive the next hour. The resilience she showed, the sheer will to survive for 44 days under those conditions, is a testament to the strength of the human spirit. But it is a strength no one should ever have to display. Now, this is the part that makes my blood boil. The part that makes me lose faith in the structures we rely on. We need to talk about the bystanders. I use quotes because bystander implies a passive observer. But in this case, I think they were accomplices through inaction. The parents of Boy C, the ones who owned the house, they knew. There is no way they didn't know. A girl was living in their son's room. Other boys were coming and going at all hours. There were screams. There were strange noises. And what did they do? They did nothing. Or worse, they were intimidated by their own son and his Yakuza wannabe friend. Imagine being a grown adult, a parent, and being so spineless that you allow a teenage girl to be tortured under your own roof because you don't want to rock the boat. They claim they were scared of Miyano, that he threatened them. And sure, maybe he did. But you are the adult. You call the police. You scream for help. You don't just turn up the TV volume to drown out the cries of a dying girl. And it wasn't just the parents. Other friends of the gang visited the house. Some reports say up to 100 people might have known something was wrong. 100 people. And not one of them, not a single one, had the courage to make an anonymous phone call. It is a collective moral failure of the highest order. It shows a cultural sickness. This idea of shogunai, it can't be helped, or mind your own business. Well, when a girl is being burned alive with lighter fluid, it is your business. The end, when it finally came, was as brutal as everything that preceded it. On January 4th, 1989, over a month after she was taken, the boys decided they were done with their toy. Junko had been beaten severely for losing a game of mahjong. Yes, mahjong. They beat her with barbells. They set her on fire. The sheer senselessness of it is suffocating. After hours of this final assault, she succumbed to her injuries. She died alone, in pain, far from everyone who loved her. But the horror didn't end with her death. These cowards, terrified of getting caught, decided to dispose of her like garbage. They put her body into a 55-gallon oil drum. They filled it with wet concrete. They took this drum to a reclaimed land area in Koto, Tokyo, and dumped it. They thought that was it. They thought they had gotten away with the perfect crime. They went back to their lives. They laughed. They probably boasted about it. Miyano reportedly even bragged to people about what he had done. That is the level of arrogance we are dealing with. They truly believed that because they were minors, because they were smart, the world couldn't touch them. But secrets like that, they have a way of festering. They weigh heavy, even on the souls of the wicked. Eventually, the law caught up with them. But did justice? That is the question that haunts Japan to this day. Because of the way the investigation unfolded, it wasn't a brilliant piece of detective work that cracked the case initially. It was their own stupidity and loose lips. Police were investigating another matter entirely when the threads started to unravel. When they finally found the drum, when they cracked open that concrete tomb, the condition of Junko's body was so horrific that seasoned investigators, men who had seen everything, threw up. They wept. It was a crime scene that defied logic. But here is the kicker, and here is where I want you to really listen, because this is the controversial part that still enrages people almost 40 years later. Because these monsters were under 20 years old, they were tried as juveniles. In Japan, the juvenile law is designed to rehabilitate, not punish. The idea is that a child's brain isn't fully formed, so they deserve a second chance. And on paper, that sounds noble. But tell me, does someone who tortures a girl for 44 days deserve rehabilitation? The sentences were a joke, a slap in the face to Junko's family and to the very concept of justice. The leader, Miyano, got 20 years. 20 years for stealing a life in the most brutal way possible. The others got even less, 5 to 10 years. Some of them were out walking the streets by the late 90s. They got to grow up. They got to get married. They got to have children. But Junko Furuta stayed 17 forever. Her parents had to live every single day knowing that the men who destroyed their daughter were free, breathing the same air, perhaps even smiling at the sun. One of the perpetrators even reoffended later in life, proving that the rehabilitation was a complete fantasy. It raises a massive philosophical question about the nature of evil. Are some people just broken beyond repair? And if they are, why do we insist on treating them with kid gloves? The law protected the murderers more than it protected the victim. The identities of the boys were hidden for years because they were minors, while Junko's name and face were plastered everywhere. She was stripped of her privacy, even in death, while her killers were shielded by the state. How is that fair? How is that justice? When you look at the Junko Furuta case, it forces you to confront the uncomfortable reality of human nature. We like to believe that we are civilized, that society has rules and structures that keep the darkness at bay. But this case proves that civilization is a thin veneer. All it takes is a few bad actors and a culture of silence for that veneer to crack. It forces us to ask, what would we do? If we heard a scream next door, would we call the police? Or would we turn up the volume? If we saw a friend doing something wrong, would we stop them? Or would we join in to fit in? The boys who killed Junko weren't aliens. They were products of their environment, empowered by a lack of consequences and a society that values silence over confrontation. It's been decades since 1989. The concrete drum has long since been removed. The house in Ayase has been demolished or changed, and the neon lights of Tokyo keep burning just as bright. But the whisper of Junko Furuta still lingers. It's a cautionary tale, a ghost story, and a tragedy all rolled into one. It reminds us that evil isn't always a dramatic explosion. Sometimes it's a slow, quiet rot happening right under our noses. It reminds us that we have a responsibility to each other, a duty to speak up, to interfere, to be the person who makes that call. Because if we don't, if we choose silence, then we are no better than the neighbors who sat in their living rooms while a girl's life was extinguished next door. So, as you go about your day, as you walk down your own streets and look at the houses you pass, remember Junko. Remember that safety is a fragile thing. And remember that the most dangerous thing in the world isn't always the monster holding the weapon. Sometimes it's the silence of the good people standing by. Don't be the bystander. Don't let the twilight swallow the truth. Because in the end, we are all we have. And if we don't look out for each other, no one else will.